This is the Bond Report.
Good evening, Australia. I'm Caleb Bond. Foreign Minister Penny Wong has hit out at the idea of monoculturalism and claimed it would make Australia less secure in a dangerous world. More on that in a moment. The Tasmanian government is so desperate to get its greyhound racing ban over the line that it's now resorted to lying about injuries. 4 months after pulling the bill because it didn't have the support of the upper house, they've decided to go low. I'll show you their claims and the reality later. And Nigel Farage has been re-elected in Britain, safely fending off Count Binface, but now he'll have to deal with the problems that prompted him to trigger the by-election in the first place. But first, let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Foreign Minister Penny Wong has given a speech to the Lowy Institute this afternoon where she claimed that a lack of diversity would be a threat to national security. In her Allan Gyngell lecture in Sydney, she took aim at Pauline Hanson's call for a monoculture.
I've always believed that the ability of Australians to connect with people from every part of the world is a national asset. A national asset that expands our choices in the world. The call for a monoculture is a call for Australia to curtail our choices and to cut off our connections, to look inwards, to have no friends to work with, no partners to trade with, and no opportunities to grow from.
Now, that is simply not what is meant by monoculture. It's not about cutting ourselves off from anyone. It's not about being intolerant to people from other backgrounds. It's not about living in silos. In fact, it's about getting people out of their silos. It's saying that as a country we should be one, all of us, no matter where we come from. We should all share one Australian culture rather than retreating to cultures from countries in which we no longer live. How that curtails our choices and connections, I don't know. It means, to me, a stronger Australia. But Ms Wong went on to say it would make Australia less secure in the world.
But well before we could ever realise this melancholic fantasy of monoculture, there is a lot of damage that could be done. Because Australians would be turned against each other. Australia would be a more hostile place, harder to be family, harder to be friend, colleague or neighbour. At a time where external and internal forces are seeking to divide us, turning Australians against each other makes us more vulnerable. Division makes us easier to exploit. It does not make us stronger.
Again, she says we'd be turned against each other. Well, no, not unless people want to separate themselves from Australian culture, in which case, why do you live in Australia? The idea is to bring us all together under one culture, not to make it harder to be a friend or a colleague or a neighbour, but easier, because we all share something. And this idea that it threatens our national security. A country united by a common culture and thus a common goal ought to be far more secure than one where many cultures operate in their own little pockets with their own objectives. And while I'm talking about foreign affairs, the Prime Minister had an overnight phone call with US Donald Trump where Anthony Albanese pushed for tariffs on Australia to be dropped.
The ask that I made of the President is that he consider full exemption, and the President agreed that he would give consideration to my request.
Joining me now to discuss all of this is Strategic Analysis Australia Director Michael Shoebridge. Michael, good to see you as always. I'll start with Penny Wong's comments, the Foreign Minister at the Lowy Institute today. Do you agree with her assessment that a monoculture, by which Pauline Hanson meant, you know, we all share one culture as opposed to having multiple different cultures operating under multiculturalism as we know it today, would somehow lead to a weakening of our place in the world and put us in a more dangerous place geopolitically?
No, Caleb, I thought it was a really odd speech. I mean, we're all used to Foreign Minister Wong using her speeches to congratulate herself on how magnificent she is. In this one, she even mused about how a dead historian might write glowingly of her were he still alive. But on the Pauline Hanson stuff, she was amazing. It turns out Pauline Hanson is like the Voldemort for the Labor Party, you know, this evil villain that can't be named. So we got this entire speech allegedly about foreign policy, but really self-congratulations combined with pretty awful domestic politics from Penny Wong.
It's quite extraordinary, and I don't understand how you can legitimately argue that uniting a country under one culture, and that's not to say that you come from another country and therefore you must forget that you've come from another country. Of course, we welcome good parts of other cultures to be part of ours, but uniting under one culture is exactly what you need in order to have a country that could stand up to foreign conflict or to threats, I would have thought. You need a country that is united under a common goal, and if you have a fractured country caused by many cultures operating in their own silos, you don't get that.
No, and how ironic to have a government minister use a speech allegedly about foreign policy to talk all about domestic politics and then use it in quite a divisive way and pretend she's calling for unity. I mean, it really was magical thinking from Penny Wong. Maybe she's hoping nobody but the Labor Party faithful will read this speech.
Well, too late. We've talked about it here. Just quickly, Michael, speaking of magical thinking, of course, the Prime Minister had a chat with Donald Trump overnight. He asked him to reconsider the tariffs that are currently on Australia. What do you think the chances are of any movement?
I think there's zero. And in fact, when the Prime Minister briefed journalists about his call with Donald Trump, we've only got the Prime Minister's readout, by the way. There's nothing from the White House. President Trump didn't think it was a priority to say what they talked about. We got an entire laundry list of stuff. AI, Trump's birthday, bushfires, Fiji, space. Tariffs only came up when a journalist asked a question. And what the Prime Minister got, what it all boils down to, is Trump not being rude to him. But Trump will not change course on this, and the Prime Minister knows that.
Indeed. Michael Shoebridge, good to see you as always. Meanwhile, former Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen today called time on her 27-year political career. How good are Andrea Bocelli and Sarah Brightman? Certainly much better than Jacinta Allen, yes. After 27 years as the member for Bendigo East and an ill-fated 2 years and 10 months as Victorian Premier, Ms Allen has announced that she won't be recontesting her seat in November. And having now made that announcement, she's decided that the people of Bendigo East don't need a local member for the next 3 months because she's planning to jet overseas with her family for an extended holiday. Senior Labor sources told the Herald Sun that they didn't expect her to hang around to help with the election campaign, which I'm sure is in part motivated by her hurt over having been deposed as Premier and replaced with her deputy, who comes from the right, and he, of course, immediately said he was nothing like her. But I suspect it would also come as a relief to many in the Victorian Labor Party, who'll be quite happy to have Ms Allen on the other side of the world instead of hanging around Victoria like a bad smell and reminding people that she's half the reason the place has gone to the dogs. And you'd have to say, on the whole, she won't be missed, not by most Victorians and not by many people in her own party. When Daniel Andrews left politics in 2023, Ms Allen was essentially anointed by him as his replacement. They were close. He wanted her to have the job. Ms Allen's premiership was, for all intents and purposes, an extension of Mr Andrews. I know that they spent a great deal of time swapping notes during her leadership, and to the bitter end, Mr Andrews was trying to shore up her support, and he was doing that because he didn't want to let go of the Labor Party that he moulded into his own. But with Ms Allen going and the last remaining minister from his first cabinet, Lily D'Ambrosio, also leaving politics, the expungement of Mr Andrews is in full swing, and he'd be hating that, which makes me rather happy. Ms Allen was basically Mr Andrews in a dress, but unfortunately for her, she wasn't half the political mastermind he was. She will leave Victoria far worse than she found it, and in some ways jetting overseas after announcing her retirement is perfect, because even she can't wait to get out of the Victoria that she helped create. Joining me now is Major Projects Editor at the Herald Sun, Matt Johnston. Good to see you again, Matt, and I see you're there in your home office consulting the letters behind you as you tap away on your keyboard during the day. I suppose it's no great surprise that that Jacinta Allen has decided to leave. I mean, you know, why would you hang around after the party turned around and said, you're basically the reason we're going to lose the election?
Yeah, I think this was no surprise to anyone. The timing of it was just what we were waiting for. Everyone was expecting her to sail off into the sunset and leave her seat to one of her appointed people to try to win it for Labor, but the Nationals and One Nation, I think, are having a real crack, and they are pretty excited about getting into Bendigo East.
Indeed. I suppose the question, just to talk local politics for a second, for Bendigo East now, is that the Nats would have thought they were in with a pretty good shot up against Jacinta Allen, the candidate who was running against her, ran in Bendigo at the federal election and nearly turned that seat. Does it make the job somewhat more difficult now against someone who is not Jacinta Allen from the Labor Party?
It's a good question. I think Andrew Lethlean is a very popular local person. He runs a pub. He's been through the campaign, as you say, at a federal level. I think that he would see himself as sort of a front runner now in that campaign. Labor's primary vote, will obviously, one would assume, go down significantly. I know there's other people that might think, well, Jacinta had become a drag on the vote and all that sort of stuff, but I think people underestimate her local popularity in some quarters of Bendigo. I think it's still relatively strong. Whether or not she would have won the seat or not, a lot of people think she would have lost it either way. One Nation needs to start putting their candidates forward and saying what they're going to do, I suppose, for some of these seats that they're targeting. I think Andrew Lethlean would be pretty happy that Jacinta's heading off and he's the focal point at the moment.
Well, and literally heading off, I don't know, maybe tomorrow. She's imminently going overseas for a long holiday, we are told. And as I said before, I'm sure there are many people in the Labor Party who'd be happy she's not hanging around for the campaign. But after 27 years representing your electorate, it does sting a bit to basically say, oh, well, they needed me for 27 years, but they don't need me for the next 3 months. I'm just buggering off overseas and you lot can fend for yourselves.
Yeah, I don't know how the party would have viewed this. They were expecting her to resign at some point. I suppose they want clear air for the new candidate to give them any chance at all. Jacinta, like most people before her in the Labor Party, these things happen. They bind together as a loyal unit and they just disappear and don't start making problems for people. But yeah, we'll see what happens if there's a vacancy there that impacts or whether it's a good thing for the Labor Party to give a bit of clear air.
Matt Johnston, good to see you as always. Enjoy your weekend. Well, the sexual assault trial of former broadcaster Alan Jones has finished its second week today. A second accuser known as Complainant C was in the witness box today and cried in court while giving evidence. Julia Bradley has the latest.
Well, Caleb, it was a massive day in court today as we heard Complainant C giving evidence in Alan Jones' trial. He's the second of 6 people to accuse the veteran broadcaster of sexual touching or indecent assault. Now, this man was a former 2GB employee and he was working as Alan Jones' driver at the time that he alleges he was sexually touched by Alan Jones without his consent. He says he was employed as his driver and that was a role that involved driving him from the 2GB offices back to his apartment on Macquarie Street. But he said as part of this role, he was also doing things like bringing him breakfast in the morning and also household chores like ironing his underpants. He said, though, it was a dream to work at that radio station and be able to say, I work with Alan Jones. It was pretty much as good as it gets for a young kid who wants to work in radio. Now, Complainant C has alleged that their relationship took a turn when Alan Jones asked him to drive him to his Fitzroy Falls property, and he alleges that in the car Alan Jones was flirting with him, that his behaviour was much more warm and much more positive. He said when they got to the property and he went to sleep, that Alan Jones was allegedly lingering in his bedroom. He claims that when the pair then returned to Sydney, that is when things escalated, and he alleges that Alan Jones then started love bombing him and sending a barrage of explicit messages and even gave him a nickname of Donkey in reference to his genitals. Now, some of those text messages include, good morning, darling. I hope you have a beautiful day. Lots of love, big kisses, big hugs. Also, how is the donkey? Can't be that big, is it really? With references to getting it out and giving it a pull. Now, C claims that Mr. Jones then began to touch his thigh and his penis when he would drive him back to his apartment. He said At that stage, he felt violated, frozen. He said, "I never had a man touch me on the penis before. I'm not gay." He then started to tear up in the courtroom as he appeared via video link when he spoke about the first time that Mr. Jones allegedly kissed him. And he alleges that this happened in a lift up to his apartment. And he even, at the time, raised his voice and then apologised to the court for that. Now, he has alleged that unwanted kissing continued in the lifts of the 2GB officers and even in public once at a team lunch. He alleges that Jones put his hand on his leg or on his penis as colleagues make jokes about his fondness for young men. So a big day in court today as we hear from the second of Alan Jones' accusers. Mr. Jones has denied these allegations and he's pleaded not guilty to 22 charges, Caleb.
Thank you to Julia for that. And some other stories to note today. Melons, yes, we're still talking about the Prime Minister and his Japanese melons, because he's again refused to apologise today and is instead blaming his melon juggling in front of his chest on the fact that he doesn't cross his arms.
Certainly, as the interpretation that some have put on this is simply not correct. When I give interviews, anyone who has sat down with me, and there's a bit of footage of me doing interviews sitting on chairs, will see that I don't do them with my arms crossed.
I mean, come on. He simply referenced a woman bringing 2 melons, as you do, and juggled said 2 melons in front of his chest before his interviewer joked that she looked like Pamela Anderson because he doesn't keep his arms crossed during interviews. We all saw what he did. He must know what he did. Why can't he just apologise for being crude about the Japanese Prime Minister? I got it wrong, and then we can all move on. Former CFMEU boss John Setka has also been arrested at his Footscray home in Melbourne today by Victoria Police and detectives from Task Force Hawk, which is investigating rogue conduct within the construction industry. He was taken to a Melbourne police station to be interviewed and charged with using a telecom communications device to menace, using a telecom communications device to offend, and 2 charges of commit indictable offence while on bail. Police said it related to harassing and offensive comments Mr Setka allegedly made on Monday. And the Productivity Commission has recommended that the federal government scrap GST arrangements that mean Western Australia gets at least 70 cents in the dollar of GST revenue on a per-person basis. The Commission said in a report released today that the 2018 GST distribution reforms enacted by the Morrison government had achieved almost none of their objectives and made the system less equitable and more complex and had cost taxpayers more than $23 billion so far. In order to give WA its large share of the money, the government then has to compensate other states out of general revenue to make sure that they're not worse off than they were before the WA deal. As New South Wales Premier Chris Minns pointed out today, WA is incredibly rich thanks to deals like this, and I think it's about time the rest of the country got a look in. Now, I've been in the newspaper business for more than a decade, and as a newspaper man, I'd like to think I can identify a good column that just cuts through everything and nails the point it's trying to make. I'd like to think I can write one from time to time. But I read one this week from Dr Terry Goldsworthy. He's a former detective inspector in Queensland, these days a criminologist at Bond University. And he was writing about Pauline Hanson's comments last month that domestic violence was a two-way street, that it was committed by both men and women. He wrote in his piece, Hanson was factually right. While males commit higher levels of domestic violence-related offences, females do commit significant numbers of domestic violence offences too. In my 28 years with the Queensland Police Service as a detective inspector, I investigated every form of domestic violence homicide. I saw husbands kill wives, wives kill husbands, children kill their parents, and parents kill their children. In a climate where discussions of domestic violence are dominated by narratives of toxic masculinity and gendered violence, the assumption that domestic violence is only a male problem has hardened into an article of faith. It has become an absolutist ideology. Challenge it at your peril, as Hanson found out. And in those 3 paragraphs, he just cut straight through the BS, and he had the numbers to prove it. So I thought I'd get Dr Goldsworthy on the show. It's good to see you. As I say, I think you nailed the point here, which is Yes, we must acknowledge that men are more likely to commit domestic violence-related offences. But we cannot, on the other hand, ignore the fact that there are also a significant number of women who do so as well. You went through numbers in New South Wales and Victoria in your column. Just tell the viewers the reality of what is going on.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, men do commit the more serious homicide offences, domestic-related homicide offences, to greater levels. So, for instance, if you look at the latest data from the Australian Institute of Criminology for intimate partner homicide, men committed about 76%, women committed 33% of those intimate partner homicides. If you look at filicide for the last 12-month reporting period, it's equal. It's almost 50-50 in terms of percentage for offenders, male versus female. So, I mean, if you have a look, it's generally somewhere around 30% under or, just over 30% when you look at most states and most data in terms of female offending. If you look at things like coercive control, which deals with emotional and financial abuse, etc., data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare shows that the gap between male and female victims of that type of behaviour narrows substantially compared to physical actions. So, we've expanded out domestic violence to include those non-violent, non-physical aspects. And you can see there that women are, that men are, in fact, suffering those effects to a greater extent than they do in physical matters. So, and the other thing to remember, of course, is, studies have shown, as one from the AIC, the Australian Institute of Criminology, shows that males tend to underreport domestic violence. So again, you're probably not getting the full picture of the offending done against them. So I think it's important people realise that there is a substantial segment of victims in terms of victims and offenders that don't fit into the established narrative, that we get told that it's just a male problem.
Why do you think it's become taboo, and probably always has been to some degree taboo, to acknowledge that men can also be victims? And why is it that any time that is brought up, it's made out like it's in some way diminishing domestic violence that is committed by men against women? Because surely we should be able to have both discussions.
Well, we should be, and I've always maintained that we should be talking about respectful relationships. I wrote an article back in 2015 that said that, forget the gender wars, let's talk about respectful relationships. But this is a narrative, it's an absolutist narrative that comes from an artificial viewpoint that only men commit DV and only women can be victims. And I can remember doing an interview on the ABC some years ago where I cited some data from the Australian Institute of Criminology and said this percentage of offenders are female and this percentage of offenders are male. And because I was talking about all domestic violence homicides, which include intimate partner, siblicide, parricide and filicide, there was a greater number of female offenders. I was contacted immediately after the interview by a victim support service I was then working for a voluntary capacity on their committee, management committee, and interrogated as to what figure I had used. And when I said, well, I'm including all the domestic violence homicide types, they said, why would you do that? We only have to talk about intimate partner violence. And I said, well, that's the problem.
Indeed, you're so right. That is the problem, and we should be looking at the full picture. I wish we had more time. I've run out. Dr Goldsworthy, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Dr Terry Goldsworthy there, he has nailed it. After the break, the would-be robber who told the person whose house he was trying to rob that he was a policeman who wanted a glass of water, and the Queensland town where Woolworths can't open on Sunday. That more in the State of the Nation. And the Tasmanian government is making stuff up in its effort to get a ban on greyhound racing over the line. I'll have the details shortly. Read a piece today that apparently you can tell someone's age by how they refer to trying to find something on the internet. So if you wanted to find the answer to a question, let's say when Anthony Albanese was first elected to Parliament, what would you tell someone to do? I'm asking my producer to tell me in my ear what he'd say. What would you say, Andrew? What would you tell me? He'd Google. He'd say it, Google. And that's what I'd say. You're Googling something. Google is a verb, to Google. But apparently that makes me old, because the youths, the Gen Z and the Gen Alpha, are meant to be Gen Z, apparently they say search it up. You know, what's Ricky Ponting's birthday? I don't know, search it up. So there you go. If you're still Googling instead of searching it up, then you're over the hill, but at least you're in good company. All right, let's take a look at the State of the Nation. Starting this week in Queensland, where a Woolworths supermarket has lost its bid to be able to open on Sundays. Now, I'd never heard of a Woolies not opening on a Sunday, but there's a type of zone in Queensland where big shops are banned from opening on Sundays unless they're given an exemption. And this particular Woolies in one of those areas near Gordonvale, which is south of Cairns. The National Retail Association argued to Queensland's Industrial Tribunal that other shops in the centre were also not opening on Sundays, despite being exempt, and that letting Woolies open would bring business that encouraged other shops to open. But other shops in the Gordonvale area, including an IGA, argued that it would hurt their trade. In the end, they won, and the Queensland Industrial Relations Commission Vice President Daniel O'Connor found that even on the best-case scenario, there would be a loss of full-time job equivalents in the area. I'm not persuaded that granting the order would be in the interests of business or the consumer. It's quite a quaint idea, really, that a Woolworths wouldn't be allowed to open on a Sunday. And I guess the real question is whether or not the broader community wants it that way. On the whole, I'd say they'd be able to open on a Sunday. Every Woolies I know does. But I guess if the locals would rather it didn't, then who am I to argue? In Victoria, nearly $600,000 has been spent on coffee beans and coffee machines in just one government office. When the new Premier Ben Carroll was the minister in charge of WorkSafe Victoria in February, it signed a $578,000 deal with a mob called Pelican Rouge for coffee beans and upgraded machines. And that was after the opposition uncovered $2.6 million worth of pot plants that the government paid for. How many kilos of coffee beans, how many coffee machines could you possibly get for $600K? These people must be pretty bloody thirsty, or sleepy, I suppose, for that matter. Yet another government contract that I wish I had. In the ACT, a bloke that I think we can all agree is a dead-set genius tried to break into a house with a hatchet at 3 a.m. And when he was rumbled by the owner, he claimed he was a police detective and asked if he could come in for a glass of water. Funnily enough, the owner asked for some ID, which Daniel Fensom failed to produce, so he cracked it and kicked the screen door 3 times. A few days earlier, he and another bloke went into a construction site and tried to find a money box in the site office. Fensom pleaded guilty to charges including aggravated burglary, attempted aggravated burglary, intentionally damaging property and falsely representing himself as a territory public official, and was given a suspended 2-year sentence on the proviso that he entered into a drug and alcohol treatment order. Points for creativity, I suppose, but somehow I reckon that one was doomed from the start. In South Australia, $70,000 has been put aside by a regional council to induct its new chief executive. Victor Harbour Council has hired Chris White from Prospect Council on $347,652 a year, which isn't bad. And that's a $20K pay bump from his old job, which also isn't bad. But as part of hiring him, the council set aside $70K to somehow help him settle into the job. Now, I should be clear that's not money to be paid directly to him, but it could cover things like phones and laptops and apparently training, accreditation and professional development that he might need for the role. But given he was already running a council and they've just given him an extra $20K, I'm not sure what sort of training or professional development he really needs. Certainly not $70,000 worth, but I guess this is the way things work when you're playing with other people's money. You can just put $70K over there just in case you want to spend it on the new boss. Most of you out there in ratepayer land who actually pay for this stuff couldn't even dream of having $70K in the bank. In New South Wales, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau is looking into a third potential collision in less than a fortnight at Sydney Airport. You might have seen one last weekend with the Jetstar and Qatar planes that nearly crashed into each other. It turns out just hours later, a Virgin flight had to abort takeoff after the pilots noticed a Qantas plane crossing the runway at the same time. Clearly, something is wrong in air traffic control at Sydney Airport, but this stuff is potentially life and death. There's not much room for error here, and nor should there be. This kind of stuff just isn't good enough, particularly so many incidents so close to each other. In Western Australia, a former One Nation candidate who suggested homosexuality was a mental illness has apologised for his comments. Parminder Singh appeared on a podcast and was asked if he thought people were born gay, and he replied, no, mental illness. He's now issued a statement. He says, I accept everyone. I'm sorry I hurt people. I want to clarify what I said. I was repeating something I had heard people saying on social media about homosexuality being a mental illness. I should not have presented that as a fact. I respect everyone, and I believe every person in Australia should be free to live their life with dignity, equality and respect. Now, if I just repeated everything I heard on social media, I probably wouldn't have a job. But anyway, I must say I thought Barnaby Joyce's comments that One Nation is one of the gayest parties this week was pretty funny. And this is the thing. Anyone who really thinks One Nation has a problem with gay people is just trying to whip this up out of nothing. This Singh bloke was a candidate once. He's made the comments since then. The national director of One Nation is gay. He's worked side by side with Pauline Hanson for a decade. You can attack One Nation, but at least try to be genuine about it. In Tasmania, ex-Hobart Hurricanes cricketer Aaron Summers, aged 30, was this week jailed for sexually abusing a 15-year-old girl when he was 21, but he will disgracefully only spend 10 months behind bars. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of penetrative sexual abuse of a young person and 1 count of grooming in June in the Supreme Court of Tasmania, after having previously pleaded not guilty. He was given a 2.5 years suspended sentence after 10 months this week. Now, this was a girl who he met at a Hurricanes match, then started talking to on social media before he picked her up from her home, knowing that she was underage, and took her to a primary school where he put down a blanket and sexually abused her twice. That is sick enough. But get this. In November 2021, he pleaded guilty to charges in the Northern Territory, including possessing and transmitting child abuse material and transmitting communication with someone under 16 with the intention of procuring the recipient to engage in or make sexual activity. And for that, he served 3 years and 11 months. On the day he was released, he was arrested and extradited to Tasmania for the charges I was just talking about. So having now come up on charges relating to the sexual abuse of children for a second time, he only gets 10 months. How can that be? He is a repeat offender and he gets a pretty lenient sentence. It is an absolute joke. And in the Northern Territory, dead patients are being booked in for surgery. No wonder everyone else is struggling to get into hospital. According to the AMA, the Territory's $355 million hospital IT system has blown out the time to book a surgery from 5 minutes to 40 minutes. And the system has all sorts of problems, including next of kin being incorrectly imported and dead patients somehow being booked for operations. It's so good that people are dying to get under the knife. Now, it's been a little while since I talked about the Liberal government in Tasmania trying to ban greyhound racing, mostly because it's completely dropped off the radar. Certainly doesn't seem to be going anywhere because the Premier, Jeremy Rockliff, can't get the support for it in the upper house. They don't want to do it. And you might remember that back in April, the government pulled the bill on the day that it was meant to be voted on because they worked out that they didn't have the numbers. So rather than face the music, they decided they'd try to avoid the embarrassment, though. I'm not sure they really have. And at that point, we were told it would come back to Parliament in May for a vote, but of course it hasn't. Here we are another 3 months down the line. Nothing's happening. There's a new racing minister, Roger Yench. What's going on? This thing has to be nipped in the bud. It's not fair on the poor people in the racing industry, or the dogs in the industry for that matter, to have uncertainty hanging over their heads. You know, they need an idea of what's happening, what's going to happen. Do you buy more dogs? Do you breed any more dogs? Do you have a job after 2029? Do you just pack it all in? Their guess, unfortunately, is as good as mine. But Mr Rockliff is still trying to rev it up, quite unsuccessfully, I should note. Last week, he was trying to blame Labor for the ban not getting up. He said, the only thing that is preventing the banning of greyhound racing, and indeed the legislation to support the industry and animal welfare, is the Labor Party, is Dean Winter, and is the weak leadership of Josh Wiley. We do need to end greyhound racing in Tasmania, and we will. Dean Winter is the Shadow Racing Minister. You would have seen him on the show with me many times, and Josh Wiley is the opposition leader. In what way exactly is it weak leadership on Mr Wiley's part? You've proposed to shut down an industry for political reasons, and his party has opposed it. It's rather there in the name, isn't it? Opposition. The opposition isn't duty-bound to back everything the government wants to do, and you can't just say it's the opposition's fault your bills can't get up. It's your job as Premier, as the government, to convince other MPs of the merits of your argument. And you want to talk about weak leadership? Well, Premier, why don't you take a look in the mirror? Because your weak leadership is how we got here in the first place. Leadership, as far as I'm aware, is about taking a principled stand, backing it in, and then taking other people along with your argument, leading them. That's the exact opposite of what's happened here. Mr Rockliff hasn't been leading, he's been led.
For whatever the criticism you have of me, mate, you know where I stand on stuff.
Do we, though? Remember the pre-election Mr Rockliff, who just 2 days before the state election in July last year wrote to the North West Greyhound Racing Club to voice his support for greyhound racing. This is from the letter. I know that the racing community and more broadly the Tasmanian community want a racing industry that is fair, humane and sustainable across all three codes, including greyhound racing. The government is committed to support the longevity and sustainability of the racing industry, which, as you know, generates close to $208 million in economic activity for Tasmania and which involves more than 6,400 people. The government also remains committed to providing funding support for a training solution on the North West Coast once we have received additional funding advice from Tas Racing and other stakeholders. And then look at post-election, Mr Rockliff. This is 22 days after the election.
It's clear that we need to draw a line in the sand when it comes to the greyhound racing industry in Tasmania. For many years now, and increasingly so, there's been concerns around animal welfare, and we're seeing an industry that is at the crossroads, in decline, and does not meet community expectations anymore.
What changed? Well, the fact that the Liberals once again couldn't form government in their own right, and so they needed the support of the crossbench, and to secure the support of the Greens, he threw greyhound racing under the bus. One position before the election, one after. That's not leadership. That's duplicitous political opportunism. So I won't be taking any lectures from Mr Rockliff on leadership, that's for sure. But the Tasmanian government's new attack dog on this, pardon the pun, is the government whip, Marcus Vermey. He's put out 2 press releases about greyhounds this week. This was the first on Monday. It read, Greyhound Racing New South Wales put a race on over the weekend. It was called We Stand with Tasmania. In horrific and distressing scenes, a dog was injured. Now, in race 2 at Temora last Sunday, and according to the steward's report, Manila Shelby galloped onto another runner soon after the start and fell, and a vet examination revealed an injured tricep and a possible scapular fracture. Now, that's an injury that most dogs recover from perfectly well, and the dog was stood down for its own safety from racing for 60 days. All the right things have been done. Muscle injuries and fractures are pretty common in sport. Dogs wouldn't be any different. It's a bit of a stretch to call it horrific and distressing. And I will note at this point that Mr Vermey is a butcher by trade. His job is literally to cut up dead animals and sell them. But you can just imagine how he must have been salivating when he saw a dog had been injured. And in a race named after Tasmania, I can put out a press release. I mean, it is sick how these anti-racing people in some way actually revel in injuries because it gives them something to wave their arms about, you know, to talk about. But then he put out another press release today. It said nearly every single day a greyhound is hurt, maimed or killed racing. Sadly, another dog has received a horrific injury in Launceston overnight. Pressure is mounting on this embattled sport. Josh Wiley must put animal welfare before Dean Winter's ego. This horrific incident should be more than enough for Labor to know they're on the wrong side of history. Will they front the cameras today to explain why greyhound racing should be allowed to continue? How many more dogs will die due to Wiley's weak leadership? Blimey, Charlie. Well, a few things. One, he asks, will Labor front the cameras today to justify their support of greyhound racing? Well, why don't you front the cameras, Mr Vermey? My team asked Mr Vermey and the Premier and the Racing Minister to front up for an interview with me today, and we never heard back from any of them. Why won't they front the camera here? My door is always open. But he says a dog received a horrific injury in Launceston last night? Well, a spokesman for Tas Racing, the racing authority, said today that media reports that Rojo Coco suffered a serious injury in race 1 at Launceston were, quote, false and misleading, and that after falling, all he had was a small graze and a minor nosebleed. I mean, that's the sort of stuff that my cats do to each other when they're play fighting at home. And Mr Vermi is making up rubbish about how it was horrific. Well, for the avoidance of doubt, this was the horrifically injured Rojo Coco this morning.
Coco's going good this morning.
Does he look horrifically injured to you? And anyway, if they're going to put out a press release every time a dog gets injured, are they going to do the same in horse racing? They're going to put out a press release every time a horse gets injured in the gallops or in the trots? Because I know the Premier owns trots horses. He's had shares in trots horses. He currently has a share in a gallops horse. We're going to get a press release every time one of them gets injured? I highly doubt it. These people aren't arguing honestly. They are making stuff up and they know it. Now, I'll say it again. My door is open to Mr Vermi or the Premier or the Racing Minister to come and have a chat. I'd love to. And I hope they do next week. I hope they can come in front of the camera as they ask of Labor. Coming up, Nigel Farage has comfortably been re-elected in the by-election he forced in his seat of Clacton-on-Sea. So now we have to see what happens with all the integrity concerns that led him to resigning in the first place. More on that in a minute. Let's cross to the UK, where Nigel Farage has this afternoon, early morning UK time, won the by-election in Clacton-on-Sea with 62.8% of the vote, followed by Count Binface with 26.7%. None of the other 32 candidates, a record in the UK, managed to get to 500 votes. Joining me now is News24 contributor Emily Carver. Emily, good to see you as always. So Nigel Farage obviously has won this by-election, but he didn't show up to the count. Why was that? And I don't mean Count Binface by that, by the way.
No, he didn't turn up for the count, didn't turn up for the declaration in Clacton. He's the first MP not to do so since 1981, and that's because the candidate there was a member of the IRA and was in prison. So this is a tad unprecedented in a way, but he says that he was advised by Essex Police that there was some kind of organised campaign to disrupt and degrade the results. That's what he's saying. However, Essex Police have sort of come out and said, actually, we had lots of security there. You know, we were going to look after this event in the way that we should, so there was no reason for him not to necessarily attend. So now, of course, the media are focusing on that. Did Nigel Farage not want to be there because it might have been a little bit embarrassing to accept his position as the MP for Clacton when the guy next to you is a bin face, some kind of space warrior, very bizarre. And then there were sort of 30 oddball characters as well who'd also turned up to try and throw their hat in the ring too. So it would have been quite the picture, but this did allow Count Binface to sort of say, well, look at me, I've got the most votes in this room. I'm the winner in this room because Nigel Farage hasn't bothered to turn up. Now, we do know there have been a lot of threats against Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has spoken openly about there being death threats. We know that Anne Widdecombe, his colleague in the Reform Party, was murdered just a few weeks ago in her own home. The investigation is still ongoing into that, but there is a prime suspect there. So you can understand why Nigel Farage might be a bit worried, but it does seem a little bit strange because he's not the type to want to be scared of things, is he? He's the type who wants to be there in the action, isn't afraid of being disrupted. So I think this might have been an optics decision, but I don't know 100%. I can't say 100%.
So what happens now? He's back in Parliament, but presumably all the problems that led him to resigning in the first place, these investigations into funding he's received, don't go away. What happens now?
Well, this is the point, really. Why did Nigel Farage trigger this election in the first place? It was because there's been a huge amount of media scrutiny, particularly coming from the Sunday Times newspaper and also the left-wing Guardian, about this £5 million donation that he received from a Thai-based cryptocurrency billionaire tycoon Christopher Harborne. Now, Nigel Farage has insisted that there were absolutely no strings attached to this, that he was given legal advice, that he did not need to declare this to the Houses of Parliament, that he did not need to. He insists on that. However, there is a Standards Committee investigation ongoing, which could end in September. There could be a result in September, or this could drag on for months and months and months. There's also questions about his relationship with a man called Posh George, who was convicted of fraud over in the United States back in 2017. And he's sort of helped out. He's been very close to Nigel Farage. There's questions over what he's paid for in terms of funding and things like this. So there is an endless sort of onslaught against Nigel Farage at the moment. And even before that, there were accusations that he'd been racist in his school days. You had, students coming out who are now in their 50s, 60s, saying Nigel Farage was racist.
And that was all a bit jumped up, I think. I'm sorry, we've run out of time, Emily. But
sorry.
No, that's all right. We'll get you back soon because this story ain't going away. Emily, good to see you as always. After the break, Leah Mendes will join me from Alice Springs ahead of Kumanjai little baby's funeral. Don't go away. Now, tomorrow will be the funeral for Kumanjai little baby in Alice Springs. Of course, she was found dead in April after a 5-day search that shook the country, after which Jefferson Lewis, 47, was arrested and charged with murder and other offences. People attending the funeral have been asked to wear her favourite colour, which was pink. Joining me now from Alice Springs is the Australian's Liam Mendes. Liam, I understand there was meant to be a memorial today and that was called off. What happened?
Thanks for having me, Caleb. Yeah, that's right. So it's been 3.5 months since Kumanjai little baby was tragically, allegedly kidnapped and murdered in Alice Springs. And in that time, her family has been going through what's called sorry business. And essentially, the family wanted to have a very private memorial service tomorrow, the funeral tomorrow, and they really wanted to keep that to themselves, and they wanted to have a separate memorial which was going to happen today or yesterday, but due to a bit of a disagreement between the various relatives in her family, they decided not to have that. But what that means is that the whole community now has been invited to come together and actually attend her funeral, which will be held at a cemetery in Alice Springs tomorrow morning.
What sort of turnout are they expecting, do you know, Liam? I know that you've had a fair bit to do with the family and the members of the town camp.
It's anticipated to be a very large turnout. The one number that I heard this week was 1,500 people. It could be more than that as well, and everyone's been urged to wear pink. That was her favourite colour, and that's just one way that people are being asked to come and pay tribute to her. She was obviously lost at such a young age, 5 years old, and in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. And this is a case that really the entire country was paying attention to. It developed into a huge story, and so it should have.
I understand, Liam, that Kumanjai little baby's father will not be attending the funeral. He is currently in jail and has been denied bail to go.
Yes, so he had a bail application, a real last-minute bail application on Wednesday. Originally, he'd actually been told by Northern Territory Corrections that they'd be able to facilitate an escort for him to be able to come to the funeral safely and to pay his respects to his daughter with the family, and his Kumanjai little baby's mother as well was open to that. However, the court at last minute, the corrective services said that they weren't able, they didn't have the resources to make that happen. What instead has happened is that on Wednesday he made the bail application. The bail application was refused by Judge Hopkins because he found that it would not be safe for Kumanjai little baby's mother.
I'm sorry to stop you there, Lee, because
10 o'clock.
we've hit the top of the hour, but we'll be keeping an eye on that tomorrow, and we'll keep in touch with you. Thank you for your time as always. He does great work at The Australian. Thank you for joining me tonight. My word is my bond. Here's Steve Price.